So what is the come to the first ascending tracts. So namely the ascending tracts, the first we can make it the number one, anterior spinothalamic tract. So this usually starts from the spinal cord and reach to the thalamus. So we always remember the word itself will be indication where it is starts and where it is end. So the spinothalamic, that is the starts from the spinal cord and reached to the thalamus. So these tract crossed. The crosses means the fibers which are crossing from the opposite sides, that is from the right to the left or left to the right. So it is called as crossed tracts. So mainly this anterior spinothalamic tract, which is located in the anterior white column, and it is crossed from the one side to the opposite side. So this mainly transmits the impulses that related to the touch and pressure, simple touch and pressure. So the lateral spinothalamic, it is also a crossed tract that is located in the lateral white column, then that transmits the pain and temperature. So similarly, the Fasciculus Gracilis, this is uncrossed, not crossing from the one side to the opposite. It is uncrossed tract that is mainly concerned with the impulses from the leg and lower part of the trunk. That is usually considered as a proprioceptive sense of knowledge. That is proprioceptive impulses from the muscles, tendons and joint to the cerebral cortex, that is from especially lower part of the trunk and also as well as leg. Then Fasciculus Cuneatus. So this is also an uncrossed. So these nerve fibers which will be concerned with the impulses from the upper part of the trunk, arm region and neck region. So these fibers are mainly transmits the vibrations and fine touch, tactile localization and discrimination. So that is the Fasciculus Cuneatus. Then similarly again anterior spinocerebellar, that is a crossed, and posterior spinocerebellar, that is uncrossed. So these are also a transmits the impulses that mainly related to the proprioceptive sense of knowledge, that is from muscles, the tendons and the joints of to the cerebellar region or to the cerebellum. So the word itself spinocerebellar, that means spinal cord to the cerebellum. So anterior means which will be located in the anterior white column. Then similarly the posterior spinocerebellar, so this is uncrossed. So the same which will be transmits the impulses, that is the muscles, tendons and the joints. So spinotactile, see this will be mainly related to the visual reflexes from the spinal cord to the visual reflexes. Then spino-olivary, so this is crossed tract, that is proprioceptive impulses via inferior olivary nucleus, pain and temperature. So dorsal tract, lateral tract, that is uncrossed, mainly related to the proprioceptive impulses. So just you can see up this figure. So this is the white columns. So anterior, lateral and posterior, that the area of the white matter. So there particularly the crossed pyramidal tract. Number one you can just see it will be a crossed, that is from one side to the opposite side. Tract of goal, that is number two. Then tract of Burda, that is fasciculus spinothalamic, lateral spinothalamic, that is the fourth area, that is then the anterior corticospinal, like that. So these are the portions, just the group of nerve fibers in the white matter area. This is just for the examples, like that the different portions. So just to be remember of this figure, so here the group of nerve fibers that is in the form of ascending pathway and descending pathway. Ascending tracts are usually sensory impulses transmitted through that nerve fibers. The descending means that is motor pathway from the brain to the spinal cord. So this is the communication between spinal cord to the brain part of the cortex. Then we'll come to the descending tracts. So the descending tract, you can see the corticospinal, that means cortex of the brain to the spinal cord. So these are crossed fibers. Similarly, the corticospinal, that is usually called as pyramidal tract, that is uncrossed fibers. There is a two group of corticospinal. One is a crossed and another one is uncrossed. So this is the mainly controls the voluntary movement. So this from the motor area, they transmits the impulses, motor impulses that controls the voluntary movement. For example, movement of the hand, movement of the leg, any voluntary movements that will be controlled by corticospinal tract. That is usually called as crossed and uncrossed. The uncrossed is known as the pyramidal tract. Then Rubrospinal tract. So this tract is crossed, that is from the red nucleus of facilitatory influences on the midbrain, flexor muscles, tone and posture. So maintaining the posture of the body and as well as muscle tone control. Then similarly reticulospinal, that is medial, uncrossed, lateral, both crossed and uncrossed. So medial there is uncrossed, but lateral is both aspects. Some are crosses and some are uncrossed. So particularly this brain step reticular information, the formations, action on voluntary movements and muscle tone. Whatever the voluntary movements and muscle tone, that will be controlled by this reticulospinal tract. It has two groups, medial and lateral group. Medial group is uncrossed, but the lateral group has both concepts, crossed and uncrossed portion. So here the tectospinal. So what is that? It is a cross. So from the tactile nucleus to the spinal cord. So that is reached to the superior colliculus, that is spino-visual reflexes. Similarly, vestibulospinal, that is uncrossed, that is lateral vestibular nucleus of medulla oblongata. So that is the position of tectospinal and vestibulospinal. So from the tectum and from the vestibulo. So these particularly in connections of spino-visual reflex and also control the body equilibrium. There is a balance controlled by of this lateral vestibular nucleus of medulla oblongata. So that is called as vestibulospinal tract. Then olivospinal. So mostly it is crossed and it is particularly from inferior olivary nucleus of medulla oblongata. So this will be starts from the inferior olivary nucleus of the medulla oblongata, but non-known forms a part of extrapyramidal system. That is the point you have to be remember. So this is about the briefly some of the important nerve tracts, that is the connection between the spinal cord and the brain. So now we'll come to the briefly the functions of the spinal cord. So the function of the spinal cord, what it is simple. It is convey the sensory impulses from peripheral to center and conduct the motor impulses from center to periphery. So just it is act as a reflex center. So the main function is just only a transmission of the impulses, that is sensory impulses and motor impulses. So sensory impulses from periphery to the center, then motor impulses from center to the periphery. Whatever the information is coming from the peripheral, that transmits to the brain through spinal cord. So that is why it is just as a media, and in associated with that transmission of the impulses, it is also act as a serves as a reflex center. The reflex center means the immediate response of the body to the stimulus. So that is another important function of the reflex center. So just be remember, the spinal cord is in a media that is transmits the sensory and motor impulses, and there is a reflex center. It acts as a reflex center. So what do you mean by this reflex arc and reflex centers? So be remember, the reflex arc is the shortest route and quick in voluntary responses to a stimulus. The immediate, the shortest route, immediate, that would be take a voluntary response to a stimulus, and reflexes represents the body principal mechanism. So usually the reflexes are represents the body principal mechanism. So what is the reflex action? So be remember and concentrate. The reflex is an inborn stimulus response mechanism. What is that? The reflex is an inborn stimulus response mechanism, basic, automatic, and quickly protective mechanism of the nervous system without participation of higher center. So that is called as reflex action. For example, just you see the communication between the two people. So the one person is just to make an action of throw, so immediately the other person should be closes his eyes whether it will be hit to me. So in that way, the immediate body response mechanism, that response mechanism immediately that center in the spinal cord. So that is why it is usually called as reflex action. Be remember, it is an inborn stimulus response mechanism, that is basic, automatic, and quickly protective mechanism of the nervous system without participation of the higher center. So the reflex classifications depending upon the inborn or acquired. So usually the reflex classifications will be made as a depending on the inborn or acquired impulses or stimulations. So unconditional reflexes or inborn reflexes. So unconditional reflexes or inborn reflexes. So what will happen here? So these are natural reflexes present since the time of birth. For example, the secretion of saliva when drop of honey kept in mouth, or of a newborn baby for the first time micturition. So that means suppose the baby or in the fetus, you can just put the one drop of honey in the mouth of the baby. So what happens? It will be start for chewing. So that is the first of the stimulus of the baby. So that is usually called as the inborn or acquired. That means it is coming from the born itself or in previous itself only. Then acquired reflexes, that is second one. What will happen in this acquired? There will be a, these are developed reflexes after training. So once you are giving the training to the people or to the bird, so that will make as an acquired. So getting that. So after training, acquired after the birth. So for example, secretion of saliva when after the hearing the name of the known edible substances. Just it will be by a name after the development or after the birth. For example, just you are telling that it's a very good piece of chocolate. So immediately the saliva is secretion. So that is the portion of acquired reflexes. One is the earlier in during the early stage, and the second one is acquired reflexes. So even according to the situation of the center, there are some classifications, and these classifications depending on situation of the center. For example, spinal reflexes, the center in the spinal cord; medullary reflexes, the center in the medulla oblongata; the midbrain reflexes, center in the midbrain; cortical reflexes, the center in the cerebral cortex; the cerebellar cortex, the centers in the cerebellum. Like that, according to the location, according to situation of the center, we may classify, we may divide as a different reflex centers. For example, spinal reflexes, that indicates the centers are in the spinal cord. Medullary reflexes, the centers which are located in the medulla oblongata. The midbrain reflexes, the center is in the midbrain. Cortical reflexes, the centers in the cerebral cortex. Cerebellar cortex or cerebellar reflex, that center is in the cerebellar cortex. Like that, we have to make it up the things. So then the classification depending upon the number of synapse. The synapse means, that is the communication between one neuron to the another neuron. So usually monosynaptic reflexes. So here in the monosynaptic reflexes, what happens? The communication between only two neurons, one neuron to the another neuron, that is monosynapse, the communication from one neuron to the another neuron, that is junction of the one neuron axon to the cell body of the another neuron, that is usually called as monosynaptic between the two neurons. So that is example is usually stress reflex. Then another one is polysynaptic reflexes. Polysynaptic means more than two, that communication between three neurons or more than three, like that. So that is usually called as polysynaptic reflexes. So usually the example is crossed extensor reflex. The crossed extensor reflex means, for example, if you are walking or you are going on the road, just a walk. So what will happen? Immediately your right leg is on the some sharp instrument like a thrown or a some piece of any sharp instrument. So what happens? Immediately you are taking back of the right leg, and simultaneously there is a body balance. So the left leg is not going to flexion, it makes as a extension to maintain the balance of the body. So this is called as crossed extensor reflex. So the stimulation is one side, and other side, that is the different actions, different response mechanism. That is best example is, while you are walking, your right leg is suppose for on the sharp instrument, immediately the right leg is flexion and left leg is extension. So usually this is called as crossed extensor reflex. Then similarly, we can go for in clinical classifications. The clinical classifications, the superficial reflexes, and the particularly what will be happens in the superior superficial reflexes. So elicited from the surface of the body, just on the surface of the body, there is any reflex actions. For example, corneal reflex and conjunctival reflex. For example, just you can going to touch the cornea, immediately there is a eyelids are closes. So that is superficial reflexes. For example is the corneal reflex and conjunctival reflexes. So usually the fifth cranial nerve afferent and efferent nerve is seventh cranial nerve. The center is in the pons. So just in involvement of the superficial reflex, fifth cranial nerve, afferent and efferent nerve. That is the seventh cranial nerve. The center is in the pons region. So similarly, we can go for plantar reflex. Plantar reflex, stroking the sole, plantar flexion and adduction of toes, that is L5 to S2 segments, that is usually plantar reflex. For example, just you can give the stimulation to your plantar surface of the foot. So immediately what happens? The plantar flexion and also adduction of the toes, that is usually by located in the L5 S2 segment. Then similarly, the deep reflexes. So the deep reflexes are usually biceps jerk, that is percussion flexion of the forearm. So for biceps jerk means just you can give the hit to the in front, the anterior part of the elbow joint. There is a biceps muscle. So that if you just give the stimulation to the biceps muscles, that's insertion level in the elbow joint region, so immediately what happens? There is flexion of the forearm. So immediate the elbow will becomes flexion. That is a response mechanism. So here particularly the reflex center is in the C5, C6, that is cervical, fifth and sixth level. Then similarly triceps jerk. So immediately you can just similarly on the posterior aspect of the elbow joint, just the insertion region of the triceps muscles, you just give a jerk in the posterior part of the insertion level of the triceps muscles. There what will happen? So immediately there is an extension of the forearm. So this will be considered as a reflex centers, that is in the biceps insertion level. If you hit, that is biceps jerk, triceps jerk in the insertion level of the triceps muscles. So like that, this is the immediate response of the body mechanism. So here you have to make very clear. So one is receptor neuron, that is sensory neuron, then center, then motor neuron, then effector. Receptor means it receives the information, then transmits to the sensory neuron, that reaches to the center, then it transmits to the through motor neuron, and there is an effector. Just you have to be, this is an example, patellar reflex. So what will be here in the patellar reflex? Monosynaptic, contains one sensory and one motor. So just you are beating or you are just giving the stimulation to the knee region. So that is just the ligamentum patellae. So if you are giving the stimulation to the ligamentum patellae, that will be immediately transmits to the center, to the spinal cord, that you can see. Number one is the hitting. Number two, that neuron that transmits the impulses and reaches to the spinal cord, and immediately it will be transmitted to the another neuron, that is motor neuron, and that will be transmits the impulses, and that will become as an effect. How it will be the effect? Immediately there is an extension of the knee joint. So this is one of the clinical examination system in especially neurological disorders. So in the neurological disorders, so here we are going to do some of the clinical examinations by just giving some test. So this is one of the example, the patellar reflex, that is monosynaptic. So muscle spindles and the myotic reflex. So here also again be remember, so that is one of the most familiar reflexes is the stretch reflex. It is known as stretch reflex, also known as the knee jerk, that is myotic reflex. In its simplest form, it is two neuron loop. One is afferent and another one is efferent. One afferent means that is a sensory neuron, and another one is motor neuron, that is efferent system. So this will be the point. So you can see here the afferent neuron is connected to the muscle spindle which detects the stretch in the muscle. The efferent neuron is the motor neuron. See, this is the stretch receptor, and that transmits to the motor neuron. That motor neuron is becomes effector. So here it is a just example of this portion of the monosynaptic reflex action. So be remember of this one is monosynaptic. I hope you are clear about this point. Then we'll come to the polysynaptic. So polysynaptic is usually the portion of the contains of one sensory, one motor, and one association neuron. So here three neurons. One is sensory neuron, one is motor neuron, one is association neuron. So usually this is polysynaptic. So example is flexor reflex and crossed extensor reflex. So here flexor reflex and simultaneously in the opposite side extensor reflex. So contralateral reflex, crossed extensor reflex and ipsilateral reflex, stretch reflex or flexor reflex. So this is usually polysynaptic action. As I told you know, while walking, what happens? Your right leg is on the sharp instrument. Immediately the one side there is an flexion action and opposite side that is crossed, that is extensor reflex. So at the stimulation side is flexure and opposite side non affected but it is extensor action. So these are usually polysynaptic crossed extensor portion. So this is the just example. Just you can see here the pain receptors to the one sensory finger, the sensory neuron that will be goes and reach to the spinal cord. Immediately it will be transferred to the another neuron, that is association neuron, that communicated to the motor neuron, and that motor neuron will be transmitted to the effector, so that is to the muscles. So immediately what will happen? There is a flexion of the finger. So this is the empathy polysynaptic example. So be remember of this figure. See, the sensory neuron receives the sensory information, reaches to the spinal cord, and then there is a synapse with the interneuron, that is also called as association neuron. So that information again transmit to the motor neuron. So here what happens? Polysynaptic. So the three neurons, sensory neuron, association neuron and the motor neuron. So that motor neuron is transmits the impulses to the muscles, and the muscles will become the action, and immediately there is a flexion of the joint or the flexion of the finger. So that will be make indications of the particular polysynaptic reflex action. So this is one of the clinical examination points, the clinical anatomy of this particular nerve structures. So like that, you have to make it identifications. So you can see in this also that will be the cross sections of the spinal cord. So usually what happens? So the sensory information which will be transmits to the spinal cord, and again there is an association neuron, and that will be transferred to the motor neuron, then there will be an effector. So like that, this is polysynaptic. So simultaneously that information is again go to the higher center or to the higher level. So that is the point. Be remember, this is the polysynaptic action. So see here, that is crossed from one side to the opposite side. So the sensory one side, that is sensation stimulation, is one sided, and that will be transmitted to the opposite side. Then effector is opposite side, that is from the right side there is a stimulation, then left side there is an effect. So this is usually called as crossed reflex action. The crossed reflex action means the crossing the impulses from one side to the opposite side, and effect is also opposite side. This is an just in a pathway of the neurons, that is crossed portions. So here we have to make it the regions. So multiple motor pathways in the cord. So usually there are multiple pathway. That means not in a single. There is several pathways which innervative a motor neurons. They can be roughly grouped into the voluntary motion pathway, postural pathway. The voluntary pathways includes the lateral and anterior corticospinal system as covered by the basic motor section. Like that, the multiple pathway present in the spinal cord in a different group, in a different classifications, and generally it is called as pathway, the sensory pathway and motor pathway. We can briefly as we remember the sensory pathway and as well as motor pathway. Like that, the pathway of the nerve fibers is within the spinal cord. So these are the positions we have to go for different aspects. So we remember the three basic pathways. Number one, vestibulospinal, tactospinal, reticulospinal. So usually some of the group. So in that portions, so where it is originate, where it is ends. In that formations it will be there. Say for example, vestibulospinal. So that will be starts from that vestibular nucleus, that is in the superior corticula of the portion, and that is formation is respectively like that this portion. So similarly rubrospinal. So just you can see of this figure, see the corticospinal from this cortex to the spinal cord, and similarly the tectospinal from the tectum of the superior nucleus, and also vestibulospinal vestibular nucleus of the pons, then that will be communication and crosses, that is the lateral side. So this is the just as a figure. See, this is the example of plantar reflex. Just you give the plantar, you see there is a flexion and reduction of the fingers. This is just an example. So thank you for the today classes. So if you wanted the details, again it will be in a dimensional portion of this particular individual systems. So I think you are understanding of this much of the portions. So this is a different level study in a deep and a depth portions, occur the clinical aspect and almost all the portions of the things. I hope you are clear about